The morning of August 15, 1949, dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, feel sharp-edged and significant. Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance of the old railway tunnel on the outskirts of town, her cotton dress fluttering in the warm breeze, her saddle shoes dusted with the red clay that seemed to cover everything in this part of the state. Behind her, 3 others waited with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Are we really doing this?" Tommy Brennan asked, pushing his horn-rimmed glasses up his nose. At 19, he was the youngest of the group, fresh out of high school and working at his father's hardware store while he saved money for college. His lanky frame and perpetually uncertain expression made him seem even younger than he was. "We've been planning this for weeks," replied Marcus Webb, his dark eyes fixed on the tunnel entrance. At 23, Marcus was the oldest, a veteran who had come back from the war changed in ways he rarely discussed. He worked at the steel mill now, his powerful shoulders and calloused hands a testament to the hard labor. The Geological Survey said these tunnels are completely safe. They've been abandoned for 20 years. "Safe from collapse, maybe," said Elena Rodriguez, adjusting the canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "But that doesn't mean we should be poking around in there." At 21, Elena was studying to be a teacher, her intelligence and natural skepticism balanced by a fierce loyalty to her friends. She had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about caves and tunnels in Mexico, stories that always ended with warnings. Sarah turned to face them, her auburn hair catching the morning light. "Look," we all agreed. "This is our last adventure together before everything changes. Tommy's leaving for state in 2 weeks. Marcus got that job offer in Pittsburgh. Elena, you'll be student teaching in Harrisburg. And She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I'm getting married in September." The others fell silent. Sarah's engagement to Robert Carlyle, the son of Millbrook's wealthiest family, had been announced in the society pages of the newspaper. It was a good match, everyone said. Robert was handsome, successful, destined for politics. But Sarah's friends had noticed how she rarely smiled when she talked about him, how her enthusiasm for the wedding planning seemed forced. "This tunnel," Sarah continued, "goes all the way through Ravens Peak, 4 miles straight through the mountain. When the railway company abandoned it in 1929, they just sealed it up and forgot about it. We'll be the first people to walk through it in 20 years. We'll come out on the other side in Coopersville, and we'll have done something together that no one else has. Something we'll remember forever." Tommy shifted his weight nervously. "My dad said they sealed it because of accidents. Workers who went missing, strange sounds. He said the company was losing money because men refused to work there." "Superstition," Marcus said firmly. "Every old tunnel has ghost stories. It's just a hole through a mountain, nothing more." Elena looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and saw something in her friend's eyes that made her relent. Sarah needed this. She needed to feel brave and free, needed to do something that was hers alone before she became Mrs. Robert Carlyle and disappeared into the life that had been chosen for her. "All right," Elena said, "but we stick together, we keep moving, and if anything seems off, we turn back immediately." "Agreed?" They all nodded, and with flashlights in hand, they entered the tunnel. The temperature dropped immediately, the summer heat surrendering to a damp coolness that smelled of stone and earth and something else, something ancient and undefinable. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being pulled forward into the darkness ahead rather than bouncing back from behind. The tunnel walls were rough-hewn rock, glistening with moisture, and old railway ties still lay scattered across the floor, relics of a forgotten purpose. For the first hour they walked in relative silence, awed by the sheer scale of the excavation. The tunnel was wide enough for 2 railway cars to pass each other, and tall enough that even Marcus, at 6 feet 2 inches, didn't have to duck. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing support beams that had begun to rot in places, and occasional side passages that branched off into impenetrable blackness. "My grandmother used to say that mountains are alive," Elena said, her voice echoing oddly, "that they breathe and dream, that tunnels are like cuts in their skin that never quite heal." "Poetic," Tommy said, trying to sound brave, "but also terrifying. Thanks for that." Sarah laughed, and the sound seemed to travel ahead of them, as if beckoning them forward. "We must be almost halfway through by now." But Marcus had stopped walking. He stood perfectly still, his flashlight pointed at the ground, his expression troubled. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "The railway ties," he said slowly. "They're pointing the wrong way." The others looked down. It took a moment for them to understand what he meant, but then it became clear. The wooden ties, which should have been running perpendicular to the direction of the tracks, were gradually shifting orientation. It was subtle at first, but the further back they shone their lights, the more obvious it became. The ties seemed to spiral, as if the tunnel itself was rotating. "That's impossible," Tommy whispered. "It's just the angle we're looking at them from," Elena said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Or maybe they were laid incorrectly." "Railway ties are never laid incorrectly," Marcus replied. "Not in a tunnel like this. The whole structure depends on precise engineering." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Maybe we should—" She never finished the sentence. A sound interrupted her, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was low and resonant, like the note of some massive instrument being played very far away, or perhaps very close but through layers and layers of stone. It vibrated in their chests, in their bones, in the fillings of their teeth. "What the hell was that?" Tommy's flashlight beam shook as his hand trembled. The sound came again, longer this time, and with it came something else, a sensation of movement, though none of them were moving. It felt as though the tunnel was sliding sideways, or they were sliding within it, or both at once. The darkness seemed to press closer, to become more substantial, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, their flashlight beams didn't illuminate anything at all, as if the light itself had forgotten how to interact with the world. Then everything snapped back to normal, or at least to what passed for normal in the tunnel. The sound faded, the sense of movement stopped, but something had changed, though none of them could quite articulate what it was. "We need to go back," Elena said, her voice sharp with fear. "Right now." But when they turned around, they found that the tunnel behind them looked different. Not dramatically so, but enough to be noticeable. The support beams seemed newer, less rotted. The walls appeared smoother, as if decades of weathering had been reversed. And in the distance, far behind them, there was a light. Not the entrance they had come from, which should have been visible as a distant gray circle, but something else. Something that pulsed, with a faint, sickly green luminescence. "That wasn't there before," Marcus said, his military training kicking in, his voice calm but alert. "Neither was that," Sarah said, pointing ahead. In front of them, perhaps 100 yards distant, the tunnel seemed to narrow. Not in a natural way, but as if the walls and ceiling were leaning inward, drawn together by some invisible force. And within that constriction, something moved. It was impossible to see clearly. Their flashlights couldn't quite penetrate the shadows there, but there was definitely movement. A writhing or flowing motion like water or smoke or something that combined properties of both. "This is insane," Tommy said, his voice cracking. "This doesn't make any sense. We need to—" The sound came again, but this time it was accompanied by words, or something like words. They weren't spoken in any language the four friends recognized, yet somehow they understood the meaning, felt it imprinted directly onto their consciousness. "You are expected. You have always been expected. Come forward or go back. But choose quickly, for the moment of choosing is brief." "Did you all hear that?" Sarah whispered. They nodded, too frightened to speak. Marcus made a decision. "We go back. Whatever's happening here, we don't need to understand it. We just need to get out." They turned and began walking quickly back the way they had come, but within minutes it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The tunnel seemed longer now, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. They walked for 10 minutes, then 20, then 30, and the entrance, whether the one they had come from or that strange green-lit alternative, never seemed to get any closer. "This is impossible," Elena kept repeating. "This is absolutely impossible." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest, making it hard to breathe. She thought of Robert, of her parents, of the life waiting for her on the other side of this nightmare. She thought of her wedding dress hanging in her closet and wondered if she would ever see it again. "Stop," Marcus said suddenly, holding up a hand. "Listen." They fell silent. At first Sarah heard nothing but her own ragged breathing and the rapid thump of her heart, but then gradually she became aware of another sound. Footsteps. Not their footsteps, but others, echoing from somewhere ahead in the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows and all four of them gasped. It was a man, or had been a man, though now he was something else. He wore the tattered remains of what might have been a railway worker's uniform, but his skin was the color of limestone, and his eyes glowed with that same sickly green light they had seen behind them. He walked with a strange, gliding motion, as if his feet didn't quite touch the ground. "Turn back," the figure said, his voice like grinding stone. "You should not be here. Not now. Not in this between time." "What are you?" Marcus demanded, stepping protectively in front of the others. "What's happening to us?" The figure tilted his head, studying them with an expression that might have been curiosity or pity or something altogether alien. "I was like you once. In 1927, I walked into this tunnel with my crew. We never walked out. We became part of the mountain's dreaming, caught in the fold where time bends back on itself. The company sealed the tunnel because they knew, though they never admitted it. They knew that this place exists between moments, that it is a threshold." "A threshold to what?" Sarah heard herself ask. "To other whens," the figure replied. "The mountain is old, older than mankind, and it dreams of all the times it has seen, and all the times it will see. The tunnel pierces its dreaming mind. Usually, the dreams do not notice you, but you came at the wrong time, or the right time, depending on your perspective. You came when the mountain was restless, when the barriers between when and when were thin." Tommy was shaking his head frantically. "This can't be real. We're hallucinating. There's carbon monoxide or something in here making us see things." "Believe what you wish," the figure said, "but you must choose. The tunnel is shifting, moving through the mountain's dream of time. Behind you lies 1927, 22 years before you entered. Ahead of you," he paused, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Ahead lies something else, another when. If you keep walking forward, you will eventually emerge, but you may not emerge into the time you left." "And if we go back?" Elena asked. "If you go back, you will emerge in 1927. You will be lost in time, displaced, unable to return to your own when without walking through the tunnel again. And it may not be willing to let you pass a second time." The four friends looked at each other, terror and confusion warring on their faces. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible, insane, a nightmare from which she desperately wanted to wake. "How do we get back to 1949? Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the fear Sarah could see in his eyes. The figure began to fade, becoming translucent, merging back into the shadows from which he had emerged. His last words echoed through the tunnel. "You must go forward, through the constriction, where time itself bends, through the heart of the mountain's dream. But be warned, the mountain may demand payment for passage. It always does." Then he was gone, and the four friends were alone again in the darkness. Sarah wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "We have to go forward. We can't go back to 1927. Our families, our lives, everything we know is in 1949. Assuming we can even get back to 1949, Tommy said miserably. "The only way to find out is to keep going," Marcus said. "Together. No matter what happens, we stay together." They began walking forward again, toward the constriction where the tunnel narrowed and the shadows writhed with that impossible movement. As they drew closer, the sense of wrongness intensified. The air itself seemed thick, resistant, as if they were pushing through something more substantial than mere atmosphere. The temperature fluctuated wildly, one moment freezing, the next sweltering. Their flashlight beams bent and twisted, illuminating things that shouldn't exist, doorways that opened onto endless voids, faces formed from the stone itself, whispers that seemed to speak in their own voices from years they hadn't yet lived. "Don't look at any of it," Elena said, her hand gripping Sarah's tightly. "Just keep moving forward. It's trying to distract us, to make us lose our way." The constriction loomed before them, and now they could see it clearly. The tunnel didn't just narrow, it twisted, folding in on itself like a Mobius strip carved from solid rock. The center of this impossibility was a darkness so absolute that it seemed to pull at them, to draw them forward with an almost gravitational force. "Hold hands," Marcus commanded. "Don't let go no matter what." They formed a chain, Marcus in front, then Sarah, then Elena, then Tommy bringing up the rear, and stepped into the constriction. Immediately Sarah lost all sense of direction. Up became down, forward became backward, and she couldn't tell if she was walking or falling or simply being pulled through some cosmic membrane. She felt her friend's hands in hers, the only anchor to reality, but even that sensation seemed distant and uncertain. Images flashed through her mind, though whether they were memories or visions or something else entirely, she couldn't tell. She saw herself in her wedding dress, but Robert's face was wrong, distorted, aging and de-aging in rapid succession. She saw her mother crying, but whether from joy or sorrow was unclear. She saw Tommy standing in a college classroom, but the walls were covered in symbols she didn't recognize. She saw Marcus in a uniform, but not one from any war she knew. She saw Elena teaching children, but their faces were blurred, shifting, as if they were still waiting to be born. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. They stumbled out of the constriction, gasping and disoriented, their hands still locked together. The tunnel around them looked normal again, old, abandoned, the walls rough and damp, the air cool and still. "Is everyone okay?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. They checked themselves, patting their arms and legs as if to confirm they were still solid, still real. Everything seemed intact. "Look," Sarah said, pointing ahead. The exit. There it was, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, a gray circle of daylight growing larger as they stared at it. They began to run, desperate to escape the tunnel, to feel sunlight on their faces, to breathe air that didn't taste of stone and time and impossibility. They burst out of the tunnel into brilliant afternoon light, and for a moment they were simply grateful to be out, to be safe, to be alive. They stood on a hillside overlooking a small town, Coopersville presumably, though none of them had ever been there before. The valley below was green and peaceful, dotted with houses and farms. But as their eyes adjusted to the light and their breathing slowed, they began to notice things that seemed wrong. The cars on the distant roads looked strange, more rounded, more colorful than the boxy vehicles they were used to. The houses had a different quality to them, more uniform somehow, and in the distance strange structures rose against the horizon, towers of glass and steel that seemed far too tall, too impossible. Tommy pulled a newspaper from a trash can near the tunnel exit. Someone must have left it there, perhaps a hiker or explorer. He stared at it, his face going pale, then silently handed it to Marcus. The date on the newspaper was June 17th, 1993. "No," Sarah whispered. "No, no, no." They had entered the tunnel in 1949. They had walked through it for perhaps 2 hours, maybe 3, but they had emerged 44 years later, into a world they didn't know, into a future they weren't supposed to see, and as they stood there, staring at each other in horror and disbelief, none of them noticed the strange absence they should have felt, the hunger that comes from missing breakfast and lunch, the fatigue that comes from hours of walking in fear and stress, the thirst that comes from physical exertion. None of them noticed that they didn't feel any older at all. The first night was the hardest. They had wandered down from the hillside in a daze, 4 young people in clothes from 1949, carrying nothing but their flashlights, and the growing realization that everything they had known was gone. The Coopersville they entered was not the sleepy farming town that should have existed, but something larger, stranger, connected by wide highways to other towns, lit by tall poles that cast orange light across parking lots that seemed impossibly vast. They found shelter in an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town, its windows broken, its pumps long since dry. Marcus broke the lock on the office door, something he would never have done in his own time, but the rules seemed different now, less important in the face of their displacement. Inside they huddled together, 4 points of a world that no longer existed, and tried to make sense of the impossible. The newspaper could have been a mistake, Tommy said, though he clearly didn't believe it. A misprint, or maybe someone's idea of a joke. "Look around you," Elena said, her voice flat with shock. "This isn't 1949. The cars, the buildings, the lights, everything is different. We're not in our own time anymore." Sarah sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at nothing. She kept thinking about her wedding, now scheduled for a day that had passed 44 years ago. She thought about her parents who would have spent decades wondering what had happened to their daughter, who might be dead now, or old, or simply gone. She thought about Robert, who had probably married someone else, lived an entire life without her. "We have to go back," she said suddenly. "Back through the tunnel. If it brought us forward, it can take us back." Marcus shook his head. "We don't know that. And even if it could, we don't know how it works. We might end up somewhere else entirely, further forward, or back to 1927 like that thing warned us about." "So what?" Sarah's voice cracked. "We just stay here, in a world where we don't exist, where everyone we know is dead or ancient? We don't have money, we don't have identification, we don't have anything. We have each other," Elena said quietly. "That's something." They fell silent, each lost in their own private horror. Outside, they could hear sounds that were familiar and yet alien, The whoosh of cars moving faster than any car they'd known, the hum of electrical equipment, voices speaking casually about things they didn't understand. Tommy was the first to notice. He was looking at his hands, holding them up in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. "I don't feel any different," he said. "I should be exhausted. We've been walking for hours. We haven't eaten since breakfast, a breakfast that happened 44 years ago. But I don't feel hungry. I don't feel tired. I feel exactly the same as when we entered the tunnel." The others looked at themselves, at each other, and realized he was right. There was no fatigue, no hunger, no thirst. It was as if their bodies had been frozen at the exact moment they entered the tunnel, preserved against the ravages of time while the world aged around them. "The mountain's dreaming," Elena whispered. "That thing in the tunnel, it said we became part of the mountain's dream. Maybe that's what happened to us. Maybe we're not quite real anymore. We're real enough," Marcus said, pressing his palm against the concrete wall. "We can touch things, interact with the world. We're just unchanged, unaged." "But for how long?" Sarah asked. "Will we ever age? Will we ever need to eat or sleep? Are we even human anymore?" No one had an answer. Over the following days, they learned to navigate this strange new world through observation and careful theft. They stole clothes from a charity donation bin, choosing items that looked unremarkable, trying to blend in. They watched how people used the strange payphones with buttons instead of dials, how they inserted plastic cards into machines to get money, how they referred to things by names and acronyms that meant nothing to four people from 1949. Elena was the first to grasp how much the world had changed. She found a newspaper, not stolen but discarded, on a bench, and spent an entire afternoon reading it cover to cover. When she returned to their makeshift camp in the woods outside Coopersville, her face was ashen. "The war is over," she said. "Not our war. Korea happened, and another one in Vietnam. The Soviet Union fell. Men walked on the moon. Computers, they're everywhere now. These machines that think somehow. The world we knew, it's completely gone." She spread the newspaper out, and they gathered around it like mourners at a funeral for the past. There were photographs of things that seemed impossible. Machines smaller than a typewriter that could supposedly process information faster than any human mind. Cars that moved without anyone steering them. Buildings so tall, they seemed to challenge heaven itself. "Look at this," Tommy said, pointing to an advertisement. "It says you can have movies in your own home, not just on television on these little disc things. You can choose what you want to watch, whenever you want." "That's nothing," Marcus said, his finger tracing another article. "This says they're talking about a global network that connects computers all over the world. People can send messages instantly, across oceans. The entire knowledge of human civilization accessible to anyone." Sarah found herself fixated on the society pages, on the photographs of weddings and anniversaries. The clothes were different, the hairstyles strange, but the underlying emotions were the same. Joy, hope, the beginning of new chapters. She wondered if Robert had found that with someone else, if he had been happy, if he had ever thought of her in the decades that followed her disappearance. "We need to find out what happened to our families," she said. "We need to know if any of them are still alive." They made their way to the Coopersville Public Library, a modern building of glass and brick that would have seemed like science fiction in their time. Inside, they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information available. The card catalogs they knew had been replaced by computer terminals, and after watching a helpful librarian show an elderly patron how to use one, they fumbled their way through searches for their families. What they found broke their hearts in different ways. Marcus's parents had died in 1967, first his mother and then his father 3 months later. There was a brief obituary mentioning their son Marcus, who had disappeared in 1949 and was presumed dead. His sister had married, had children, and was still alive, living in a nursing home in Pittsburgh. She was 79 years old. Tommy's father had lived until 1981, running the hardware store until his death. His obituary was longer, describing him as a pillar of the community, and noting that his son Thomas had vanished under mysterious circumstances decades earlier. There was no mention of Tommy's mother, but they found her death certificate dated 1955. She had been 42. Elena's family had moved to California in 1952. There was a wedding announcement for her sister Maria, a birth announcement for a nephew she would never meet. Her grandmother, the one who had told her stories about living mountains, had died in 1950, just 1 year after Elena disappeared. Sarah found her own wedding announcement in the archives. Local woman missing, wedding canceled. There was a photograph of Robert looking somber and handsome in his suit. 6 months later, he had married someone else, a woman named Catherine from Philadelphia. They had 3 children. Robert Carlyle had become a state senator, then a congressman, and had died in 1988 at the age of 63. The obituary made no mention of his first fiancée, the one who had vanished on an August morning in 1949. They left the library in silence, walking through streets that belonged to a world they had never been meant to see. Around them, life continued. Teenagers lounged outside a pizza place blasting music from a boombox. Business people talked on portable phones, smaller than any phone had a right to be. A television in a store window showed moving images in brilliant color, advertising something called the Internet. "We're ghosts," Tommy said finally. "We died in 1949, in that tunnel, and now we're just ghosts walking through a world that isn't ours. We're not dead," Marcus said firmly. "We're here. We're real. We just need to figure out how to live in this time." But how could they live? They had no identification, no social security numbers, no birth certificates that matched their apparent ages. They were 21 and 19 and 23 and 20, in a world where they should have been 65 and 63 and 67 and 64. Any official interaction would raise questions they couldn't answer. They became invisible people, living in the margins of society. Marcus found day labor jobs, the kind where employers didn't ask too many questions and paid in cash. Elena worked under the table at a diner, her quick mind and natural warmth making her a favorite among the regular customers. Tommy helped at a bookshop whose owner seemed willing to overlook the lack of paperwork in exchange for someone who could read and discuss the classics. Sarah cleaned houses, her 1949 homemaking skills surprisingly relevant. They shared a rented room in a boarding house run by an elderly woman who asked no questions as long as the rent was paid weekly in cash. The room was small, barely large enough for 4 mattresses on the floor, but it was shelter, and it was theirs. Slowly, they began to adapt. They learned to use the technology of this new world, though it often felt like learning a foreign language. They watched television in the boarding house's common room, absorbing the culture and concerns of the 1990s. They learned about AIDS and the Gulf War, about grunge music and the fall of the Berlin Wall, about a thing called email and something called the World Wide Web that was just beginning to change everything. But they never forgot who they were, where they had come from. Every night, lying on their mattresses in the dark, they would talk about their old lives, keeping the memories alive like tending a flame that threatened to go out. They talked about the specific blue of the sky over Millbrook in summer, the sound of the church bells on Sunday morning, the taste of Sarah's mother's apple pie. They talked about the future they had expected, college and marriage and children and careers, a future that had been stolen from them by a tunnel and a mountain and time itself. 6 months after their emergence, on a cold December night, Elena made a discovery. She had been reading at the library, her one luxury, the place where she felt most at peace, when she came across a book about unexplained disappearances. There, in a chapter about Pennsylvania mysteries, was a photograph she recognized. The 4 of them, young and smiling, taken at a church picnic 2 weeks before they entered the tunnel. The caption read, "The Ravens Peak 4, Sarah Mitchell, Marcus Webb, Elena Rodriguez, and Thomas Brennan disappeared on August 15, 1949, after reportedly planning to explore the abandoned railway tunnel through Ravens Peak. Despite extensive searches, no trace of them was ever found. Local legends suggest the tunnel is cursed, that it exists partly in our world and partly in some other realm. The entrance was permanently sealed in 1951. She brought the book back to their room and they sat together, staring at their younger selves, though they looked exactly the same now as they did in the photograph. "We're a legend," Tommy said with a bitter laugh, "a cautionary tale for kids who want to explore dangerous places." "We're more than that," Sarah said quietly. "We're proof that the impossible can happen, that time isn't as fixed as people think it is." Marcus, who had been quiet all evening, suddenly spoke. "We have to go back." The others turned to look at him. "Go back to the tunnel," he clarified. "Find out if we can return to our own time, or at least understand what happened to us." "The entrance is sealed," Elena reminded him. "So we unseal it. We have nothing to lose. We don't age, we don't sicken, we don't fit in this world. Our families are gone. Everyone we knew is dead or ancient. What kind of life is this? We're supposed to be young people with futures ahead of us, not immortal refugees living in the margins of someone else's time. Sarah felt something stir in her chest, something that might have been hope or might have been despair. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. Even if we could get through the tunnel again, what makes you think we'd end up in 1949? We might go forward or backward, or to some other time entirely. At least we'd be moving, Marcus said. At least we'd be trying. I didn't survive the war just to spend eternity hiding from the world, working for cash under the table, pretending to be someone I'm not. I'd rather take the risk. They argued about it for hours, but in the end they all agreed. They had to try. They had to go back to the tunnel and face whatever mysteries it held, because the alternative, living forever in a world that wasn't theirs, watching decades pass while they remained frozen at 19 and 21 and 23, was simply too bleak to accept. The next morning they began to plan their return to Raven's Peak. The journey back to the tunnel took 3 days. They traveled by bus through a Pennsylvania that was both familiar and foreign, watching the landscape shift from the urban sprawl of Coopersville to smaller towns, and finally to the mountainous terrain they remembered. But even the mountains looked different now, logged in places that had been forested, developed in areas that had been wild. The roads were wider and smoother, the signs all different, the world fundamentally transformed. They got off the bus in Millbrook, or what had been Millbrook. The town had grown, absorbed into the spreading suburban sprawl of the region, its old downtown now surrounded by strip malls and chain restaurants. They walked through streets Sarah had known since childhood, but nearly every building had been replaced. The ice cream parlor where she'd had her first date was now a dry cleaner. The church where she was supposed to have been married was still standing, but renovated beyond recognition. "Don't think about it," Elena said, taking Sarah's arm. "We're not here to mourn. We're here to find our way home." They bought supplies at a hardware store. Crowbars, flashlights, rope, water, and food, even though none of them felt hunger or thirst. They took a taxi as far as the old logging road that led to the tunnel entrance, then hiked the rest of the way through woods that had grown thick and tangled in the 44 years since they'd last walked this path. The tunnel entrance had been sealed, as the book had said, with a concrete wall and a metal gate, but decades of weather and neglect had weakened the barrier. Working together, using the crowbars and Marcus's considerable strength, they pried open a gap large enough to squeeze through. The tunnel beyond was exactly as they remembered it. Dark, damp, smelling of stone and earth, and that indefinable ancient quality, but now it felt less threatening, more familiar. This was where they had changed, where they had become something other than ordinary people. This was the threshold between when and when. "Same rules as before," Marcus said. "We stick together, we keep moving, and we don't let go of each other no matter what." They formed the same chain they had before, hands locked together, and began to walk into the darkness. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. They walked through a tunnel that was just a tunnel, their flashlights revealing nothing more than rough stone walls and rotting support beams. Tommy began to wonder if they had been wrong, if the tunnel had been a one-time anomaly, if they were doomed to simply walk through to the other side and emerge in 1993 again. But then the temperature began to fluctuate. The air grew thick and resistant, and they heard it again, that low resonant sound like a note from some massive instrument vibrating in their bones and teeth. "It's starting," Elena whispered. The walls began to change. One moment they were rough-hewn stone, the next they appeared smooth as glass, then back to stone again, cycling through states of being like a projector flipping through slides. The railway ties beneath their feet spiraled and shifted, pointing in directions that seemed to defy geometry. And then they saw the light ahead, that same sickly green luminescence they had seen before, but brighter now, more intense. Within it, shapes moved, humanoid but not quite human, figures that might have been the ghosts of railway workers or might have been something older, something that had lived in the mountain long before humans came to carve their tunnel. One of the shapes drifted closer, coalescing into something almost recognizable. It was the same figure they had encountered before, the one who claimed to have been trapped here since 1927. But he looked different now, less substantial, more fragmented, as if he was being slowly erased. "You came back," the figure said, his grinding stone voice tinged with what might have been surprise. "No one ever comes back. We want to go home," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "To our own time, to 1949. The figure tilted his head in that alien way. "Time is not a river you can swim against. It is a mountain, layered and complex, with passages that wind through different strata. You walked through one passage and emerged in a different layer. To return to your layer, you must find the right passage. And how do we do that? Marcus demanded. You must go to the heart of the mountain's dream, to the place where all the passages meet. But I warn you, the mountain is more awake now than it has been in centuries. It knows you are here. It knows you defied its natural order by surviving the passage unchanged. It may not let you leave. We don't care, Elena said. We'll take that risk. The figure seemed to study them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Follow me then, but understand, what you will see in the heart of the mountain is not meant for human eyes. The mountain's dream is vast and strange and terrible. It may break your minds. We're already broken, Tommy said quietly. We've been living 44 years out of time. How much worse could it be? The figure turned and began to drift deeper into the tunnel, toward the constriction where the walls bent impossibly. The four friends followed, their hands still locked together, their flashlights cutting through the green-tinged darkness. As they approached the constriction, the wrongness intensified. The air became syrupy, hard to move through. Their flashlight beams didn't illuminate properly anymore. Instead, the light seemed to stick to surfaces, leaving glowing trails behind. They heard whispers in languages that predated human speech, saw faces in the stone that watched them with ancient, inhuman eyes. Don't look at any of it, the figure warned. Keep your eyes on me. Keep moving forward. They entered the constriction, and once again, Sarah felt reality come apart around her. But this time, instead of being bombarded with random images, she felt herself moving through something structured, something intentional. It was as if they were walking through the mountain's actual memories, seeing what it had seen across millennia. She saw the mountain when it was under the sea, felt the weight of ancient oceans pressing down. She saw it rise, thrust upward by forces beyond comprehension, saw forests grow and die and grow again across its slopes. She saw the first humans arrive, saw them regard the mountain with awe and fear, saw them tell stories about the spirits that dwelt within it. She saw the tunnel being carved, saw the workers drill and blast their way through living stone, saw the mountain's dream disturbed for the first time. She saw men vanish, consumed by the passages between time that they had inadvertently opened. She saw the company seal the tunnel, saw decades pass in seconds, saw the seal weaken and break, saw 4 young people enter in 1949. She saw herself, saw all of them, frozen at the moment of their passage, suspended in the mountain's dream like insects in amber. And she understood. They hadn't traveled through time so much as they had been removed from time, placed in a state of non-being, while the world continued without them. They were neither alive nor dead, neither past nor present, but something else, something the mountain had made them in its dreaming. Then the vision cleared, and they stood in a vast chamber that shouldn't have existed. The tunnel had opened up into a space hundreds of feet across, its walls glowing with that green luminescence. The ceiling soared above them, lost in shadows, and the floor beneath their feet was not stone, but something that looked like water, frozen in the act of flowing. Throughout the chamber, those ghostly figures drifted, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all the people who had been caught by the mountain's dream across the years. In the center of the chamber stood something that hurt to look at, a formation of crystal or stone or something else entirely, shaped like a tree but growing both up and down, its branches penetrating the floor above and below simultaneously. It pulsed with light, and with each pulse, Sarah felt the chamber shift slightly, felt reality adjust itself around this focal point. The heart of the mountain's dream, the figure said. All the passages through time meet here. From here, you can theoretically access any moment the mountain has experienced. How? Marcus asked. You must touch the formation and think of your desired time. But be warned. The mountain will resist. It does not like to release what it has claimed. It will show you things, offer you things, try to make you stay. You must be absolutely certain of your desire to leave, or you will become like us, permanent residents of the dream, fading slowly into nothing. Sarah stepped forward, her friends still holding her hands. She reached out toward the formation, and as her fingers drew near, she felt it calling to her, felt it offering her visions of possible futures and alternate pasts. She saw herself living out her life in 1993, growing old in a world that would eventually make sense to her. She saw herself going back but arriving at different times. 1945, before Marcus had gone to war. 1955, when her parents were still young and healthy. 1975, when the world was changing in fascinating ways. The mountain showed her these possibilities like a dealer laying out cards, and she realized it was trying to confuse her, to make her choose something other than what she truly wanted. Sarah, Elena said softly, stay focused. 1949, August 15th, 1949, right after we entered the tunnel. Sarah nodded, closing her eyes, picturing that specific moment. The morning sunlight on her cotton dress, the smell of summer, her friends standing beside her, the feeling that their whole lives were ahead of them. She pictured it with absolute clarity, with every detail she could remember. She touched the formation. The chamber exploded into chaos. The mountain roared. There was no other word for it. A sound of pure rage that they felt rather than heard. The floor bucked beneath them, and the walls seemed to press inward. The ghostly figures scattered like leaves in a storm, and their guide screamed in that grinding stone voice, "Hold on to each other, don't let go." Sarah felt herself being pulled in 1,000 directions at once, felt the mountain trying to tear her apart, to scatter her atoms across time and space. But she held on to her friends' hands, felt their grips tighten desperately, and she held on to her vision of that August morning with the same fierce determination. The world turned inside out. They fell, or flew, or simply moved through dimensions that had no names, and through it all, Sarah held on to two things, her friends' hands and her memory of home. She felt the mountain's fury, felt it trying to show her horrors and wonders that might make her change her mind. She saw the heat death of the universe and the birth of new realities, saw every possible timeline branching and converging, saw herself living 1,000,000,000,000 lives in 1,000,000,000,000 different worlds. But she held on, and then suddenly, they were standing at the entrance to the tunnel, blinking in bright morning sunlight. The air smelled of summer, and the red clay of Pennsylvania soil. Sarah looked down at her dress, her cotton dress with the tiny blue flowers, and it looked brand new. She could hear birds singing in the trees, and in the distance the church bells of Millbrook were ringing. "Did it work?" Tommy whispered, his voice trembling. Marcus pulled out his wallet and checked the driver's license inside. The date hadn't changed. It still showed he'd been born in 1926. He walked over to the nearest road and looked at a newspaper box. Through the glass, he could see the headline, "Berlin Airlift Continues," and the date, August 15th, 1949. "It worked," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "We're home." They looked at each other, these four friends who had traveled through time and seen impossible things, and they began to laugh and cry simultaneously. They had done it. They had faced the mountain's dream and returned to their own time, unchanged except for the memories they now carried, memories that no one would ever believe. "We should go home," Sarah said. "Our families must be frantic. We've been gone for—" She paused, confused. "How long have we been gone?" They looked at the sun, checking its position. It was late afternoon, the same August afternoon they had entered the tunnel. They checked their watches. They had only been gone for a few hours. "Time moved differently in the mountain," Elena said slowly. "We lived months in 1993, but here, it's like we only took a long walk through the tunnel. No one will ever know what happened to us," Tommy said. "We can't tell them. They'd think we were insane." "We know," Marcus said. "That's enough." They made their way back to Millbrook, four young people carrying a secret that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. They went home to their families, who asked if they'd enjoyed their hike through the tunnel, who were entirely oblivious to the journey their children had actually taken. Sarah returned to her house, where her mother was preparing dinner, and her father was reading the newspaper. Her wedding dress still hung in the closet, waiting for September. But when she looked at it, she thought of Robert as she'd seen him in 1993. Old, successful, married to someone else, happy enough. She thought of the life she was supposed to live, the future that had been planned for her. That evening she called Robert and broke off the engagement. She couldn't explain why. How could she tell him that she'd seen their future together and realized they weren't meant to be? But she was firm. He was hurt and confused, but he didn't fight it. Within a year he would meet Catherine, and everything would unfold as it was supposed to. The four friends met regularly after that, bound by their shared experience. They went to college, started careers, married other people, had children of their own. They lived normal lives, or as normal as lives could be when you carried memories of the future in your head. Sometimes, late at night, they would gather at Marcus's house and talk about what they had seen. They debated whether they should have stayed in 1993, whether they'd made the right choice in returning. They wondered if the mountain was still dreaming, if other passages through time still existed in that tunnel, but they never went back. The entrance had been sealed again, this time by the four of them working together to brick up the opening, to prevent anyone else from stumbling into the mountain's dream. Years passed. They grew older naturally this time, watching their children grow up, watching the world change in all the ways they remembered and in new ways they hadn't foreseen. They saw the 1960s arrive with their turmoil and transformation, saw the moon landing that they'd read about in that 1993 newspaper, saw computers become commonplace, just as the articles had promised. In 1993, on a cold December night, the four of them met at the library in Millbrook. Elena, now 65 years old with gray streaking her dark hair, pulled a familiar book from the shelf, the one about unexplained disappearances, the one with their photograph. But the entry had changed. Where once it had read that they were never found, it now said something different. The four friends emerged from the tunnel hours later, unharmed but strangely reluctant to discuss their experience. They lived normal lives afterward, though those who knew them said they seemed to share a secret, something they spoke of only among themselves. The timeline changed, Tommy said, now 63 and wearing reading glasses. We changed it by coming back. Or maybe it was always meant to be this way, Marcus suggested, his 77-year-old frame still strong despite the years. Maybe the only reason we succeeded in coming back was because we always had. Sarah, 64 and still beautiful despite the lines time had carved on her face, closed the book gently. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we made our choice, and we lived our lives, real lives, in our own time. That night, as they left the library and stepped out into the cold Pennsylvania air, they looked toward the mountains where the tunnel lay, sealed and silent. They thought about the mountain's dream, about the passages through time, about all the mysteries they had witnessed and survived. Do you think it's still there? Elena asked. The heart of the mountain, the formation that let us travel through time? Probably, Marcus said. Mountains are patient. Their dreams are long. Should we have told someone? Tommy wondered. About the tunnel? About what's possible? Maybe scientists could have studied it, learned from it, and maybe more people would have gotten lost, Sarah replied. Maybe the mountain would have claimed more victims. Some secrets are better kept. They parted ways that night, returning to their homes and families, to their ordinary lives in an ordinary world. But as Sarah lay in bed next to her husband, a kind man she'd met in college, so different from Robert, she thought about the young woman she'd been, standing at the entrance to that tunnel, eager for adventure and unaware of how much adventure would actually cost. She thought about the mountain and its dreaming, about the formation at the heart of its consciousness, about the passages that connected different moments in time. She thought about the ghostly figure who had guided them, who was probably still there, fading slowly into nothing. She thought about all the other people who had been caught in the mountain's dream across the centuries, those who hadn't been strong enough or lucky enough to find their way home. And she thought about the choice they'd made, to return to their own time, to live their lives naturally, to age and change and eventually die as all humans must. It had been the right choice, she was certain of that. But some small part of her, the part that was still 19 years old, still standing in the sunlight of that August morning, wondered what would have happened if they'd stayed in 1993, if they'd remained unchanging, immortal refugees from the past. She would never know. None of them would. They had made their choice, and they had to live with it. But on certain nights when the moon was full and the air was still, if you stood near the sealed entrance to the railway tunnel through Raven's Peak, you could hear something, a low, resonant sound, like a note from some massive instrument, vibrating in the bones of the mountain. And if you were very brave or very foolish, you might press your ear to the sealed entrance and hear other sounds, whispers, footsteps, echoes of conversations that were happening in times and places that weren't quite connected to the present. The mountain was still dreaming. It would dream for millennia more, long after Sarah and Marcus and Elena and Tommy were gone, long after their grandchildren's grandchildren were dust. It would dream of all the times it had seen and all the times it would see, of the passages that wound through its strata connecting when to when. And sometimes, in its dreaming, it remembered 4 young people who had walked through its consciousness, who had seen the heart of its dreaming and survived, who had chosen to return home, even though home meant mortality and change and loss. The mountain remembered, and in its slow, geological way, it respected their choice. It had offered them immortality, offered them a place in its eternal dreaming, and they had refused. There was something admirable in that, something the mountain's ancient consciousness could appreciate, even if it didn't fully understand. So it let them go, let them live their mortal lives in their mortal time. And when they finally died, Marcus in 2004, Elena in 2011, Tommy in 2016, and Sarah in 2019, all of them having lived full lives, having loved and been loved, having contributed to the world in small but meaningful ways, the mountain felt their passing like the faintest of tremors in its vast dreaming. It remembered them. It always would. And deep in its heart, in that chamber where all the passages met, the crystal formation pulsed with its ancient light, waiting for the next travelers who would be brave enough or foolish enough to walk through the mountain's dream. The tunnel remained sealed, but the passages remained open, wound through layers of time like veins through stone. The mountain dreamed on, patient and eternal, its consciousness touching moments that were past and future and sideways from the present, holding all of time within its vast and sleeping mind. And if you listened very carefully, on certain nights when the barriers between when and when grew thin, you could hear voices echoing through the tunnel, 4 young people, laughing and talking as they walked through the darkness, frozen forever at that moment of choice, that instant when they decided to come home. They entered the tunnel in 1949, emerged in 1993, and returned to 1949 without having aged a single day. And though they never spoke of it except among themselves, the experience marked them forever, gave them a perspective on time and life and mortality that no one else possessed. They had walked through the mountain's dream and come back to tell no tale but this, that time is not as fixed as we believe, that there are passages and doorways hidden in the world, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to be mortal, to be human, to live and love and die in your own proper time. The mountain remembered, and in its dreaming it honored their memory, 4 brief sparks of consciousness that had touched its vast and ancient mind, and left an impression that would last as long as the mountain itself endured.